Welcome back, my friends. Once again, we're here with Pastor Bruce Dowell. And as of our last session, we were talking a little bit about Joseph and how he parallels and is a sign of Yeshua or Jesus. Mm-hmm. And as we look at his life, while he was in the prison and going through all of his trials, his name was still Joseph, and he was recognized as a Hebrew. The people around him, they would have something to do with him and they would listen to him, but there was no way that they would even have good faith in him until something happened. And that was with the baker. The baker's dream was interpreted along with the the cupbearer. And when the cupbearer told Pharaoh, then Joseph was brought forth to Pharaoh, and all sort of things started to change. So that's kind of where we want to kick off from this point. One of the first things that Pharaoh did was change his name. And as we can see in, and I just lost the chapter. As we can see in Genesis 41:45, Pharaoh named Joseph Zaphenath-Paneah. And some translations say that means one who can find or one who seeks. But in really studying it and translating it, there is no Hebrew real translation to it, and there's not really a solid Egyptian translation. So how does this correspond? Well, after Yeshua's death and resurrection, the church was formed, and we kind of went through some of that through our last studies.
Right.
But in doing that, we find out that Yeshua's name was changed to Jesus by the church. Does that be the same as Pharaoh changing Joseph's name? Because Jesus, as far as we can tell, has no real meanings, as most Hebrew names do.
Right.
But this is a beginning of the way things go. So, Pastor, as you see these things developing, how can you see the parallels start to build through the life of Joseph and through the church at this point, starting to prosper and starting to come together? As when Joseph's name was changed, Egypt started to prosper, started to grow. And how do you think this should go from here in paralleling?
Well, the change of names, of course, is it's a very biblical concept.
Yes.
It's something that you and I are going to experience too. We will be given a new name, we're told in the book of Revelation.
Absolutely.
So the new name really, for the most part, is designed to really speak about who you have become.
Correct.
Through this conversion of crossing over.
Yes.
And in Joseph's case, he goes into Egypt with the name Joseph. Right. Then he's given an Egyptian name.
Correct.
Which I'm not even going to try to pronounce. And he's hidden under that name when his brothers come and actually meet with him.
Yes.
And then once the discovery is made that this really is their brother Joseph, then his name goes back to Joseph.
Correct.
And so I think for Joseph, he's a type of Messiah. So we're being taught in this story that Yeshua, who Joseph is reflecting,
right, exactly,
is lost to his brothers.
And basically the Hebrew people.
And the Hebrew people. And they don't recognize him.
Correct.
They don't recognize his name. And of course, that's the case today. The Christian Church has changed the name from Yeshua to Jesus.
Correct.
And I mean, we've talked about that name change before and the implications and all that, but let's just suppose for a moment that it's not that big a deal.
Right.
So they changed it. We've called him Jesus. Now the Jewish people aren't recognizing him. When Yeshua returns, I believe his name is going to return to Yeshua.
Well, I think that's true too, and that would also parallel Joseph.
It really would. And so there's a hidden aspect here in regards to the Messiah that Joseph is demonstrating for us. And of course it goes into so many other avenues.
Correct.
The name is just the very beginning of it.
Absolutely.
Right? So we're seeing the story of Joseph. You can't really put in chronological order the way it's written.
Right.
And what it symbolizes, because Joseph is thrown into the pit by his brothers and sold off. And in other words, he's dead to his people.
Correct.
In fact, his father, Jacob, tears his clothes and the whole thing.
Exactly.
When he finds out. And that's the sign of the mourner whose son or daughter has been killed or died.
Right.
And
well, even his brothers tore their clothes when
Yeah.
they found out that he was missing from the pit.
Exactly. And so, chronologically, that's a picture of Yeshua being crucified.
Correct.
Being separated out and murdered.
Right.
And so that comes at the very beginning of this story.
Yes.
So I would just warn our viewers not to try to read the story of Joseph, which is such an awesome story.
Oh, it is.
It's one of my favorites. As you read it, don't think it's in chronological order necessarily.
Right.
And so that brings us up to this point where he's given this new name and he's given a wife and he is brought right into society.
Correct.
Egyptian society in this case. And the elite side of the society,
Right.
I might add. He's the second most powerful man in the world by this time.
Absolutely.
Next to Pharaoh. And his brothers, when they come down from Israel, they don't recognize him.
That's true.
He dresses like an Egyptian. I'm sure that he's speaking the Egyptian language.
Oh, absolutely.
Absolutely. He's married to an Egyptian priestess.
Correct.
I mean, for all intent and purpose, this guy is an Egyptian.
Exactly. Now, when you look at that and compare it to the church today, the church really prospered after it was formed. In fact, it was mandated by Rome, who was first in charge, that there be no other.
Yeah.
And from that time, and through the Catholics went all through the world converting people to quote-unquote Christianity.
Yeah.
And all the other
was
churches
really
followed.
Catholicism.
Well, true.
Yeah.
True. But
it was the only expression of Christianity we had
at that time,
at
exactly.
that time, for hundreds of years.
So even though Joseph was acting like an Egyptian,
Yeah.
which he was at that point brought up to be,
Right.
he was still had the influence. And you can see that on his sons and probably his wife.
Right. Right.
So
Yeah, absolutely. It's also interesting in verse 46 here, Joseph is 30 years old when he stands before Pharaoh, the king of Egypt.
correct.
So he's really starting his... it's a foreshadow of the ministry of Messiah,
Correct.
who started at 30.
Right.
And the same thing is happening here. So we start to see these crossovers here.
Right, exactly.
You know,
There's so much that we've missed throughout our studies. It's
oh, I know.
just mind-blowing.
Yeah, absolutely. Joseph is also a picture of the Savior.
Yes, absolutely.
Joseph saves Egypt and ultimately the world from starvation.
Exactly.
So there's this famine, which is a really bad famine. It's in the whole known world, basically, which would have been the Egyptian Empire. And people are starving, and Joseph has his dream, of course, 7 years of plenty and then 7 years of famine.
Right.
And the king seeks his wisdom. What should we do?
We need to seek his wisdom.
Yeah, and so Joseph comes up with the idea that you need to harvest plentifully now and store it up. It's interesting also that in the process, he makes Pharaoh very, very rich.
True.
Richer than he already was.
Right.
Because now all these people have to buy the grain stores. And it tells us in the text that Pharaoh really benefits from that.
Yes.
So
absolutely.
That's very interesting.
Well, and you see how the Catholic Church has prospered.
Mm-hmm.
One trip through the Vatican, and you can see all the wealth that's been stored up there.
Oh yeah, they're the wealthiest Christian church in the world.
Right.
By a long shot. And they probably have artifacts and wealth that we know nothing of.
Oh yes, we know.
You know, they've got storehouses everywhere.
Correct.
Of all this stuff. So
there's another parallel.
Yeah, storehouses. Yeah, you're right. Yeah, there's so much.
It is.
In this, you know. And ultimately, when his brothers come when Joseph tells his brothers finally who he is, and this is what the scripture says, when Yeshua comes back, the people will look on him and say, this is the one that was pierced.
Right.
And they'll realize, it'll all come flooding in at that point, the truth that Yeshua is and was the Messiah all along.
Exactly.
And so Joseph, he reveals himself, and his brothers have a hard time believing it at first, which is understandable.
Right. Well, it's the same way that the Hebrew nation or the Jewish people right now have a hard time believing it.
Right, right. And finally, he exposes himself to his brothers, in my opinion.
Yes. Well,
to show them that he's circumcised.
Correct.
And then it all clicks for them.
Right.
See, even when he's talking with his brothers, he brings in his son Manasseh to translate.
Right.
He doesn't speak in Hebrew, but he knows exactly what they're all saying.
Correct.
Tells us later that he's listening in on their conversation, and he knows exactly what's going on. But he uses his son Manasseh as a translator to keep his identity hidden.
Yep, exactly.
So here we are, even in America, you know, a lot of Americans don't realize that Hebrew became our national tongue.
Yes, it did.
And yet the Lord decided to keep that isolated and hidden.
Yep.
And we speak English, and Christianity in general speaks English.
Correct.
And it will be revealed one day when Yeshua returns speaking Hebrew. Or actually, I should say, when Jesus returns speaking Hebrew.
Right.
That's going to be a wake-up call for a lot of people on both sides of the aisle.
It is. And what you just said about his son, there is also a parallel with the eldest son being the church.
Yeah.
Today. If the church is translating Yeshua to the nations right now, that's probably one of the reasons they can't fully understand it.
Right. The Jewish people.
The Jewish people, yes.
Well, and we've dressed him in every way like a Westerner.
Correct.
So Jesus is a Greek persona.
Correct, because that's the way we have made him. Just like Joseph was made to look like an Egyptian.
Exactly. So we've dressed him that way. We've presented him to the world that way, and of course the Jewish people, they can't buy into that because the Messiah is not going to be
No, absolutely.
a Westerner.
No.
The Messiah is going to be a Jew.
Correct.
So he is totally unrecognizable to the Jewish people at this point in time as being Jewish.
Right.
But he's totally unrecognizable to the Gentiles as being Jewish as well.
Well, yes, that's true.
So everyone forgets this, that he's Jewish.
Absolutely.
Through and through. So we're presenting this Greek Jesus to a Hebrew people that are waiting for a Hebrew Messiah.
Correct.
And we're all confused.
Exactly.
You know? Yeah.
It's just like the Egyptian people prospered during that time without really understanding who he was. They took him as an Egyptian.
Right.
Even though Pharaoh may have known the difference.
And even if they knew the difference, the land was prospering.
Correct. Exactly.
When people are prospering, they don't care too much about the details typically.
That's true.
You know, they don't care whether this guy's a Hebrew or not, really.
True.
You know what I mean?
Yes, absolutely.
They're prospering, they're eating, they're getting along in business, and they're happy.
Yep.
You know? And so Joseph is such a picture of all of this that as we study through the scriptures his entire story, we see one foreshadow after the next.
Absolutely.
All pointing towards Yeshua.
Exactly.
And interestingly enough, Joseph is married to a priestess of course, an Egyptian deity.
True.
Right?
Right.
And her name actually means belonging to the goddess Neith, which is interesting.
Yes.
This kind of ties in with the prophet when Gomer is commanded to marry the prostitute.
Absolutely.
You know, and it's a picture, because we have prostituted ourselves. All people have.
Right.
When it comes to faith. And Yeshua we're the bride.
Yeah.
Yeshua is going to marry this prostitute. And so here, although this gal's not a prostitute, she certainly is not a... she's not in the bloodline of Messiah, I can tell you that.
Absolutely.
In the strictest sense, anyway. She is in one sense.
Yeah.
So he's married to this pagan gal, and he has 2 sons by her.
Correct.
So now technically, because we measure the DNA of a person from the female,
right.
In this case, technically the sons are both Gentile.
Correct.
Manasseh and Ephraim are Gentiles, born from a Gentile mother. Yes, a Hebrew father, but the Orthodox teach us that biology comes down from the woman.
Yeah, it does. And you parallel that with the church, because even though the original church was Judeo-Christian, it was changed once the Romans got a hold of it.
Yeah.
And you can't recognize them.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And of course, later on, Jacob blesses both of Joseph's children.
Correct.
Manasseh and Ephraim, and he brings them in to the fold. He brings them into the family.
Exactly.
Into his family, Jacob's family. He basically takes them as his own children.
Right.
And they receive an inheritance. And that's a picture of the grafting in of the Gentile.
Yes, it is.
in my opinion.
Oh, it is.
You know.
Plus, I think if you really look at that as a grafting into the Gentiles, you notice that when they gave the blessing, he reversed it. He gave the youngest son the first blessing and the oldest son the second blessing. To me, that's the oldest son was the church, because that was the offspring of Joseph coming into the family. The church was the offspring of Yeshua being crucified. Yes, it was corrupted, but so were the children, because he married an Egyptian. The second son came in later, in my belief, and this is my opinion, represents the Messianic.
Yeah.
Because he is more believing in the original, and the Messianic is looking back to the original, which is Yeshua.
Right.
So it really blends in there also.
Yeah. Yeah. And then another point to be made about the sons, Manasseh and Ephraim, when we bless our children every Shabbat.
Exactly.
That's the blessing that we speak over them, that the Lord would make them like Manasseh and Ephraim.
Exactly.
And that's a powerful, and of course that comes right out of Jacob's blessings over the kids.
Yes, it does.
Over the kids. So that's very powerful when you think about that we are, all the Jewish people in the world and the Messianics are all praying that our children, our boys, will be like Manasseh and Ephraim.
And you know, when you really start to look at what that can mean, it means like the church that's being grafted in, that's being pulled back into the family.
Yeah.
It's not like just the Hebrews, it's not like just the Gentiles. It's the church being pulled back into the Hebrew roots.
Yeah. Yeah, because you can take these two people groups. You can take Jacob and his sons in the land of Canaan.
Right.
And there's a story going on there this whole time.
Correct, absolutely.
And we read portions of it.
Absolutely.
You know, Joseph tears his clothes when they bring the son's coat of many colors back to him.
Right.
And they make it appear that he was mauled by a lion or whatever. And so you've got this story going on here, and how the famine is, and how he sends his sons all except for Benjamin.
Right.
So you got this whole story going on here with this camp, but then we have this whole story going on over here with Joseph and his wife and his kids, and what's going on in Egypt.
Absolutely.
And in that we see God working in both camps at the same time to bring both camps together in that ultimate conclusion.
Correct.
Of coming back together.
Absolutely.
And of course there was a really tight bond when Jacob did come down to Egypt and brought his whole family with him.
Yes.
There was a bond between he and Pharaoh. Pharaoh gives them the best of the land in Goshen. And there's this bonding until we read there was a Pharaoh that didn't know Joseph rose up.
Correct.
Which was many years after Joseph and Jacob were both gone.
Correct.
Then this Pharaoh raises up. But it's interesting to see how God is working in both the camps. He's working with the Egyptians as well as working with the Jews.
Absolutely.
He's working with the secular and the pagan and with the Jewish people.
And that's the way God works. And my friends, that's all the time we have for today. But please join us again next time as we continue our studies. And if you're interested in Pastor Bruce's books, please go to PastorBruceDowell.com or to Amazon.com. They're available in both places. And I'm sure they make a very worthwhile read. I've gone through both of them and benefited immensely from both of them. And if you want to see our videos, go to www.ShilohMessianic.com and check out our YouTube section. And you can see us recording these. So until next time, Shalom.
Shalom. All right, let me use the restroom here real quick.